Had to find the source. Took me a minute. We got there. This is the Team Objection Podcast for August 8th, 2023, episode 586. I have too many things with the same name, and now I can't find them anymore, so that's a fault of my own. I can't blame anybody but myself. Welcome to the show. It's just me and Cody, you can see.
I think Dave really needs to get removed from the intro.
You think so?
He just still exists, and he keeps not showing up. Granted, I wasn't here when he was here and all of that, but...
Okay, we have to do one thing for you. Tilt your microphone. I've been meaning to tell you to do this for a while.
Like that. It doesn't tilt.
Tilt that microphone. Yeah, it should. And if it doesn't, there's a joint that we can loosen that will.
This one?
Yeah. Just so it's a little more towards you. You don't have to be like right on top of it, but that way it's not just vertical. Because you'll get better sound that way. You'll see. I keep thinking about this from NBA recordings, and then now it's like, well, now you're here for the podcast. I want that audio to be
I don't know how to do that.
crisp.
This is really good visual, but I don't know how to twist it because I'm gonna break it.
I thought you had it.
Well, I undid this but then I just made it go like that. And then Ooh.
All right, we got there. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we got there.
Okay, I figured it out.
Hello, everybody out there. Hello, Peter. Hello, Josh. Welcome. We have hot topics today. That's the name of the episode. And some of them are sports related. Not all of them are. I'm going to subject Cody to one thing he does not know about. But that's fine because just like a couple weeks ago when we did some headlines, if I'm putting all the work in, I'm going to choose what it is. Now, he suggested one of these, our first topic, so I'm going to let him go off on that. So it wasn't like Cody didn't contribute at all, but I put a fourth thing in here that I cared about because if I don't talk about it now, we're never going to.
Plus,
So
I don't know much else other than sports, realistically, and most sports, but really, it's all centralized on
TV
sports.
and
for the most part.
movies.
You're right, a little bit.
There's some holes, though, yeah. I have a weird Venn diagram of interests that I have that definitely includes some sports and some video games and a little bit of TV and movies and all sorts of other weird stuff like
And I guess
fighting
gambling.
games.
I guess gambling, which is very conveniently, that's the transition to this.
Gambling is very conveniently the transition, so I put a silly picture up of ESPN in front of a betting board, and I'm going to let you take the floor to explain what this is. I mean, I read up on it, but you tell the people what this is about.
So I'm going to go back to the NBA draft because you were paying attention to that somewhat, right?
Minimally, but I do know about the point you're going to make, yes.
So, when we talked about this in the sports gambling thing, and Dave ranted and bitched about how much he doesn't like the inundating our sports TV and news with gambling and gambling odds. And guess what? It's going to get so much worse now. It's already bad when you watch ESPN and they have plenty of these things, and you see that they use Caesars, I think is what the one that's always on if I watch ESPN and stuff like that. Now, the news started today that the Barstool Sportsbook, which is run by like Penn Entertainment, I think is what it's called, or Penn whatever.
Yep.
They have booted Barstool, sold the rest of the company that they own. They actually owned Barstool. They sold it back to their crazy-ass guy who's in charge of Barstool, and that's the end of Barstool, and we can move on. They did that because they are partnering with ESPN, which means their odds from that sportsbook will be all over ESPN, while also refusing to name their sportsbook themselves because no one knows who they are. Instead, they take up these partnerships, and now it's going to be called ESPN Bet, like BetMGM, Caesars Sportsbook, all that stuff. That's this whole branding thing that everyone wants to do. So going back to the NBA draft, which prompted all this, is Shams. I don't know how to say his actual last name, I don't think. When the NBA draft happened, there was a very clear top three players, and it had been reported who these guys were over and over again. Shams comes out on the day of the draft while working for a news outlet along with a sports book and goes on and says, actually, the guy who everyone thinks is going to go third, he might go second. There's talk that he's going to go second. And FanDuel conveniently retweets him from their sportsbook account with the odds of this guy who now will go to, and it's great odds because no one thinks he's going to go there. So why not put $10 or $5 on it? And pushes those odds, back down because a lot of money comes in on it. Come to find out, that was all basically bullshit. So now you wonder, where's the line between news reporting and trying to artificially boost odds or boost money on someone who's not generating money in that spot? I don't think it got talked about enough at the NBA draft by enough people. I think it really just kind of flew under the radar, and it was mostly people bitter on Twitter accounts or X accounts or whatever.
Which is normal.
Yeah, but they actually, I saw that and I was like, holy shit, this is actually, for once, the giant angry mob on Twitter has a fucking point. It was a really, really good point of where's the line between this. And again, I haven't liked this as a person who's been in journalism. I haven't really liked the insider people being sponsored. They get to be in commercials and shit. They're using their likeness. It's all weird. I think Ian Rappaport today has a T-shirt on one of the old school branding accounts. It's like, it's weird that you're marketing yourself as a person who's an insider or journalist and you're trying to make money after like this. It's all weird and whatever. But they all make lots of money, so I guess they don't give a shit. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna say to me, the line blurring is what's the most concerning.
Yeah, and then so we started with that, where they were in commercials and they have sponsorships and they're like partnering and all that, and that's where that was fine, if not weird. Now we've led into ESPN's going to have its name on a sports book, and at the NFL draft and at the NBA draft, and when players are signing somewhere, and all these things are going to have odds bet on them. And whenever ESPN Bet Twitter account starts, and it starts fucking retweeting shit that says, "Oh, Adam Schefter says that this player is probably going to go number 3 overall. Here's the odds on it at 10-1 because it's so unlikely." And all the dipshits believe Adam Schefter because he's built up a reputation for being pretty correct and fair and right on a lot of things he reports, bet money on it. Now, when that doesn't happen, is everyone going to start speculating, fair or not, if he artificially drove up that money to have ESPN's branded partner, pin gambling or entertainment or whatever, to cheat the system and steal people's money? And there's no way for us to know that. And I don't understand how regulatory in terms of all this, when it's an actual reputable news site, this is okay. No one cared when it was Barstool because Barstool's not actual real news.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bunch of frat bros talking about sports in their own way, but it's also almost all commentary, which is fine if you're going to be paired with a sports book because they're not actually getting tipped off to things. Schefter, Woj, everyone at ESPN, Passan, they're all going to know stuff that they either are reporting or not reporting, and now their outlet is branded with this, and it's just going to lead down a really slippery path.
The odds at the draft, we actually either talked about briefly on air, or at least we had a Twitter thread between us about it because it seemed gross at the time. And it's easy to point to the biggest betting scandals in sports and talk about how, like, oh, well, you're not really supposed to bet against anything related to your team. At the very least, you should be betting for your team to win. You can't bet for them to lose.
Yeah.
That's like the cardinal sin. But now betting is so widespread that I'm not even sure that that's an issue anymore because we're talking about dumb things like individual prop bets now. Like, who's going to score the first basket of the game, and who's to say that you don't get to a coach or somebody on like an assistant on a staff that goes, oh, well, off the tip, we'll draw up a backdoor screen and get 8 and an alley-oop. The Suns ran that play a lot to start last season before that got scouted. That would be easy to slip some information towards. It's such a small situation that it'd be a lot harder to detect. So there's in-game issues and now additional out-of-game issues like you mentioned where it's like, I don't, even before the draft example, which was the most direct and obnoxious, throughout last season, I'm not just relating to the NBA because it's what I follow the most, there were times where it's like, Kevin Durant is expected to come back from his hamstring injury. That moves the Suns' playoff odds from minus 650 to minus 600 or whatever, coming from mostly Shams, but also occasionally Woj. And it's like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
These are supposed to be insiders. These are supposed to be trusted sources of information. So as a journalist, I look at this and I go, this is fucking bad.
Yeah. I mean, we've already had Alabama's baseball coach fired because he had a starting pitcher appear and they busted him on that. Iowa State's going through a ton of shit right now with players having betted one way or the other. The NFL just suspended 5 or 6 players again. Calvin Ridley's just coming back from his suspension.
Mm-hmm.
Calvin Ridley was suspended for betting on football like a couple $1,000s, which was dumb because he makes millions, but he didn't bet against his team. He bet on his team and other sports. That's somehow considered worse by the NFL than its like television partner having insider sources for one of its biggest events of the year, because the draft's the easiest one to go on this, because I don't know how much is really going to change in-game shit. The NFL teams are still going to be secretive about injuries and all that, but it could still be a problem. It could still be, oh shit, Matthew Stafford, his neck's bothering him again. What's the Rams line against the Cardinals? Because both those teams suck. The Rams should be favored, but now with Matthew Stafford not playing, the Cardinals odds go from 3-1 to plus 150. Now they're more likely. Maybe you should bet on them as it switches.
Or the further example of that, which is hiding information you get about an injury to keep odds where they are when you know that a player is not going to play, and that influences the decision.
I mean, all of Sunday morning, because fantasy football, which obviously relies heavily on injuries, setting your lineups and all that, we have an entire show on ESPN that just for an hour breaks down the inactive report. They come through like, all right, well, at 9:30 or 9 o'clock for a 10 o'clock kickoff or whatever, we get the inactives and let's run down all of them. You start wondering what the fuck is real that you're getting and what it's not getting. I can't imagine ever wanting to bet on touching ESPN Sportsbook in any way, because I gamble on sports. You look around, you try and find the odds that are the best odds from the different sportsbooks. They're actually all off a little bit. They're not all in lockstep. And you just start wondering, how shady is ESPN stuff going to get? And how quickly into this partnership are we going to have the first scandal of this? It seems like it's going to be like 4 months at most.
Because the best case scenario out of all this is that it's gross and it's obnoxious and it takes up more time on air than it should, and it just feels like a sellout.
Yeah.
The worst case scenario is the one you mentioned, where now there are scandals and people are bought and paid for, and you're influencing coaches or players or whatever.
It's just
now
we've made such a big deal about, like, the NFL doesn't let its players bet on other professional sports. I don't care if Calvin Ridley bets on the NBA. Why do I give a shit?
No. I mean, you can argue slippery slope, but again, if you're going to be in bed with ESPN, the slope's already quite slippery.
Yeah, I mean, it's already slippery everywhere. Dave complained about this, and I went from trying to defend all the leagues to where I'm completely on the opposite side now, being like, this is a fucking disaster. Like, we'll see. It just seems like it's, this is a long-term partnership, and ESPN's desperate for money. That's the thing. I see why Disney did this or approved
they've been laying off people left and right.
Yeah, Disney's losing billions on streaming. ESPN's losing billions on streaming. It doesn't know how to platform all this shit with how expensive sports fees and things are like that. So obviously, it's an incentive I don't know what kind of money ESPN gets as of a cut from the revenue generated, but I think Penn, if I remember reading right, did pretty well in the fourth quarter at the end of last year.
Right. 10 years, $2 billion, by the way. God. And they're expected to have a seat on Penn's board within 3. So now we're talking about a two-way street of potential liability issues. Yeah. And keep in mind, they also mentioned the possibility of on-air talent talking about bets. Now, as we alluded to, there's already some programs that do this, and it may not be any different than it was before. But to me, it's like we crossed a huge line when it came to Shams, Woj, Passan, the other guys who break news for these various sports websites. It'd be one thing if Tim Legler came on and had a segment where he was like, well, I think that the Suns are going to struggle with the Mavericks full court press, and this matchup's bad for them, so you should probably look to take the odds against them tonight for this reason. That would still be awful and gross, but at least he's an analyst, so it's his job to analyze. These guys are newsbreakers, and they're the ones telling me about odd changes.
Like I think Dave was complaining, saying, I don't want to see Jalen Rose talking about the NBA. Well, good news. He'll never talk about it on ESPN again on the podcast. But he was complaining, like, why do I care what Jalen Rose's opinion is? Again, I agreed. I'm like, I could go on there and I might know just as much as he is based on trends and crap I read. I think I probably read more about the details of trends than Jalen Rose does. Well, now we've gone completely the opposite direction, where the guys who know exactly the actual truth are going to sit there and say things one way or the other, and the line's going to move. And a half point is a half point in the NFL. That actually ends up really, really factoring in. It just, again, it's not really a surprise, but we'll see how ESPN actually tries to split this and see how much they touch things the same way that Shams did. Especially when you retweet the reporter with a Twitter account from the book saying, look what they said now, or look what our guy said. Look at how good the odds are. Isn't it so tempting to take the 5-1 odd when that thing's never going to cash? Yep. It's just all a trick to dump money in, because again, it might be only $5 for every individual, which isn't a huge loss of money that they're betting on something that's never going to come true. But when the guy with 10 million followers says it, and you get a bunch of those dipshits to actually follow them, you see where you're going.
Yeah. So I'm going to be interested to see where this goes now. This happened today, so we haven't really had a whole lot of time to process it or figure out the ramifications. We don't know the long-term prognosis because, again, this was, 5 hours ago or something.
Yeah, it was the afternoon or something like that.
Yeah, it's gross. Peter mentions, I'm sure Portnoy will run Barstool flawlessly, and then says sarcasm. Yeah, you can. That's a whole other conversation about Barstool and Dave Portnoy.
I was going to say, as a person who does not enjoy Barstool in any way, I'm actually perfectly fine with him taking the company back and going back to whatever gross shit he wants to do. Everyone's complained about it. It's never going to get better with him in charge. It never was, but
Dave says Portnoy sucks. So the two of you agree on something at least. So, following the sports theme, I thought I wanted to talk at least a little bit about the Pac-12. Now, that's going to be a shame for Dave.
You used that graphic.
Yeah, I stole it.
The good news is I have Dave's information on this as we were texting off and on during the week about all of this.
Well, you can give him sort of his point of view on this, so he's in the chat, I think, as well. But so, essentially, if you haven't been following college sports whatsoever, this has been whispered about for a while, particularly when it comes to two schools in particular, about the prospect of them leaving the conference, joining up with something else, likely the Big 12 at the time. But that was a couple months ago, and then it seemed like, well, those two schools, and that's about it. It wasn't a great sign for the Pac-12, but they could just go back to being the Pac-10, just like they were. Wasn't a big deal until this week when all of a sudden the entire conference fell apart because now the Arizona teams jumped ship and other teams looked to jump ship, and Stanford put out some kind of limp dick statement about the whole situation, and it seemed like nobody wanted Oregon State or Washington State, and then they thought about what if we bring back like the Mountain West Conference in some capacity, or like the Pacific Coast Conference, and we combine a couple pieces of conferences, and now it turns out that nobody knows what's happening. Even as we are live right now, the Pac-12 has 4 teams.
It has 4 teams left. It has 4 teams left.
So it's interesting to me, just as somebody who grew up watching a lot of the Pac-10/12. You know, my stepdad's a big fan of ASU. Dave's a big fan of ASU. So like I've followed it. I don't really care myself, but it's really weird to watch the fact that this conference has existed in some form for over 100 years, and as the Pac something for more than 60, just vanish in the span of a week. It's just gone.
It's the first time that like this whole, I mean, we've talked about it because again, USC and UCLA left. Oh shit, it's a big deal. They're going to the Big Ten. Then again, it coupled with the fact that the Big Ten, the Pac-12, Pac-10, Pac-12, whatever numbers they are, have had a long-standing rivalry, especially in football, given that the Rose Bowl has been, before we got to all the TV money and championship games and playoffs and all that shit, that was the big deal game. You got a Big Ten team, Pac-10 team, they played each other. I think growing up in Southern California and being a USC fan and watching all this, it was like, you look at all the conferences and how weird they're arranged, and a lot of things have changed. You know, teams have changed, and the SEC's been pretty steady for a long time, and the Pac-10 was pretty steady for a long time. And just from like a sheer understanding how conferences work thing, wasn't it nice to have the Washington State, Arizona State, Oregon State, the 2 Southern California teams and 2 Northern California teams? It was this perfect arrangement of everyone had a perfect travel partner. It's basically like if you were trying to make a conference, not paying attention to TV market and money and success and all that. It's exactly like the layout you want, with everyone having a natural rival and you covering across all these states. And that in Colorado and Utah was fine. But I mean, you go all the way back to then, and basically the Pac-10/12 killed itself years and years and years ago when it decided it didn't want to add Texas and Oklahoma. And that backfired pretty badly, because as bad as Texas is, or not bad, but mediocre in all of its sports, seemingly, and overrated.
Yeah, not bad, but
unfortunately, they might be overrated, but that's basically a Dallas Cowboys type of mentality.
It's still Texas.
Where it's still Texas, and
still
everyone
Oklahoma.
follows it.
At the very least, their football program matters, and their women's volleyball.
They could be as bad as they want, and you know what? Everyone's going to bitch about how bad they are, so they're going to draw numbers. The Pac-10 didn't add those schools when it could have raided the Big 12 and killed the Big 12 a long time ago, and it chose not to. It added 2 mountain-y type schools, which was fine. And that basically eventually led it to dying, with all these schools eventually leaving because 2 different commissioners completely blew it, to say the least.
And I think it's funny that the Big 12, maybe because of what happened in reverse before, like you mentioned, had no such reservations this time. They're like, yeah, come on in. Yeah. Because when they said no to our schools, look how poorly it turned out for them. So sure, we'll add you. We'll figure it out later. But I did want to bring this up because your perspective on this is unique and I think valuable to listeners and our viewers, because assuming you can still talk about this, you've been gone for a while, you understand the scheduling and other logistical nightmares of having to travel for conference matchups or whatever matchups, but in general, college sports, especially the smaller ones like not football or basketball. So what does this look like for the Big 12 now when they're having teams from, say, the middle of the country have to travel out to USC or UCLA or now Washington? What is that nightmare like?
It's funny, like, so you pointed out, and thankfully some of the women that play softball for, I think it was Washington or Oregon, a couple of those schools, started pointing this out. So these girls who are from Washington, Oregon area, they got recruited to these schools, and they're going to play across the West Coast for most of their careers. Great. Their families can travel to see them. It's not that hard, because recruiting doesn't just have to do with where your school is. It depends on who you play, how often your family can come see you. That's troublesome. NAU obviously recruits a ton from Arizona for football, because those families can come up every weekend and come watch their kids play. It's easy to do. Now, those families aren't going to be able to watch their kids as Washington plays Rutgers in a Big Ten softball game, as if anyone gives a shit about that. And we could go on and on about how many schools don't, fit that or match it. But you charter for football. It's great. You get there, you land, you show up. It's a one-night stay. You're in and out. It's really, really smooth. The travel that's going to happen for, like, Eugene, Oregon, because I'm not even going to do Washington because at least it's Seattle. That's a pretty big airport.
Yeah.
Eugene, Oregon, where the University of Oregon is not a big city. It is really not that different from Flagstaff, if we're being like really, really honest. It just happens to have gotten a school that grew up into the Pac-12 and other schools didn't. I mean, NAU, we talked like this was a big deal. They were like, oh my God, ASU and U of A are leaving. Doesn't matter at all for the Pac-12. UCLA and USC and Washington, Oregon was a bigger deal.
Yeah.
NAU and the 2 Arizona schools were in a conference in the 50s together. Then guess what? 2 got bigger. NAU didn't because of their areas, and the rest is history. So going from Oregon, you're going to fly like you would fly as a regular human being. So those teams are going to have to schedule their softball matches or games or whatever to go, and you're going to have to do how many connecting flights? 2? You're going to get back and forth. So that trip, and they're going to limit it when they schedule this, and which is part of why the Big Ten added 2 West Coast schools to help USC and UCLA a little bit. But the next closest school is Nebraska, I think. And for the Pac-12, again, the Arizona schools, I actually think made a good move. They made more sense in the Big 12 than the Pac-10 or Pac-12 at this point anyway, given where some of those schools were. I think I've read that their travel really isn't that bad, except for, again, West Virginia.
Yeah, it's not that different if Arizona schools are going to Washington or...
It's just as far of a trip, I think, to Washington
Louisiana
and
or something.
Eugene as it is, exactly. All the Texas schools and the Oklahoma schools. It's really not actually that bad. But those cross-country ones are going to be maybe 2 different stops. You're going to get back and forth. It's going to be like a 5-day trip to go play like 2 softball games. 3 softball games, I guess, if it's a series and all that. And they'll get creative with it and all that, and they'll make their money. But it really does hurt most of those other athletes because they picked these schools and they had these nice situations where they were regionalized enough to go and play in a bunch of cities and areas that were easy flights for their families. If I'm an athlete, not a major sport, that goes to Oregon right now, am I still going to go to Oregon and if I lived in Oregon and I'm going to go to the University of Oregon where I'm going to play some home games and then Washington and the Californias, but half my schedule is going to be in the Midwest? Or do I actually rather just go to Oregon State, who's probably going to end up in the Mountain West, and I'm going to play Boise, and Washington State will still be in there. I think San Jose State's in there, Nevada, Reno, Vegas. I might go there if I want my family to come on the road to watch me because those trips are going to be a lot easier to go to. So it's going to change, I think, the decision-making for a lot of athletes across all these lower-level sports of do they want to stay regionalized or do they want to just go, I'm a Big Ten athlete, that's cool. And I wonder how many more people are going to transfer out of those situations as it goes on when you start realizing, oh, shit, being on a plane for 3 hours to then sit in an airport for 2 hours to then go on another plane for 3 hours is going to suck. And just wait till the weather because, again, in Flagstaff, the Big Sky, when you play Montana State and all that, travel's not really fun. And you kind of take the first flight that's available. So you're flying at 4 a.m. out of wherever to land somewhere to bus somewhere else. And unsurprisingly, not a lot of the Big Ten schools, as much as you think they're in big cities, they're not actually in big cities.
No.
Like when you go to East Lansing for Michigan State, where are you flying into? When you go to Ann Arbor, where are you flying to? If you're flying not charter, because again, football, it's easy. You get on a big plane,
lots of money.
You land in tiny little airports. It's awesome. It's like the best.
But lacrosse isn't flying charter.
Exactly, but all those non-revenue sports are not flying like this. So it's going to be really interesting to see how the 4 West Coast schools make that work with the giant chunk of Midwest schools, along with Maryland, Rutgers, Penn State, who are all in the same gigantic conference right now.
I'm not even totally sure what to make of it. I'm sure maybe the conference is big enough, maybe they divide it, and that way it helps regionalize the travel a little bit more because you can at least throw the 4 West teams into it and then a couple that are closer, right?
Yeah.
But even then, at some point you have to play the other teams in the conference, right? Otherwise, what's the point of having the conference? So there's going to be weird overlap. There's still, the things that are not going to have sports that divide into like halves, like a cross country or something, where you can't divide the conference for that. It's going to have to be one whole thing. I just kind of find it weird because, again, I was not that tied to the Pac-10-12 conference, but it's just gone.
Yeah,
maybe it comes back. They've merged with the Mountain West, and they become a new Pac-10, 12, 14. But it
won't be the same. Yeah,
no, it doesn't have the traditions. And for me, I don't give a shit about college sports, but one of the coolest things was exactly what you mentioned a few minutes ago: the tradition of they're playing. Arizona and ASU are playing for the Territorial Cup, and they're still going to probably in the new conference. Yeah. But you know what I mean? Like, this is a rivalry that goes back to 1906. Wow, cool. Here's the head-to-head record for 100+ years, and some of those matchups are going to be gone now.
And some schools have not done that and not cared. Texas A&M is a great example. They left the Big 12. They went to the SEC, and one of the SEC never really added schools. I think that membership had been the same for like 90 years before they added Missouri and Texas A&M. Texas A&M and Texas, which was a pretty big rivalry, like they don't play very often, if not at all anymore. Oklahoma State straight up said, we're not going to go out of our way to schedule Oklahoma. We got shit scheduled. Football schedules go for 10 years in non-conference. It's done.
Yeah, if you ever played the old college football video game, the one that's supposed to be coming back maybe sometime soon, about like year-over-year scheduling and home and away trade-offs. And, Even at a smaller school like NAU, they've got arrangements going out for 5-10 years now. Where
Southern, Southern Utah's scheduled for 15 years. They'll play them in 2037.
Is that the new rivalry now, right? Is that
Southern Utah's the one they retained when Southern Utah left this conference for the different conference.
But I mean, the point being, like, all these things have layers, and it's easy just to be like, well, whatever, we're going to rip the Band-Aid off. It's like, yeah, but these have ramifications that you're not even thinking about.
And again, it's about money and TV stuff. It goes back to, the same thing as ESPN with sports gambling. So much is all based around live sports is the one thing that advertisers want to be on. So the advertisers and the networks control most of this shit. I'm not convinced that the Big 10 or Big 12 really, really at its core wanted to necessarily add these schools. But guess what? We had Pac-12 After Dark. Now we're going to get like Big 10 and Big 12 After Dark because ASU and U of A and Colorado, they're going to get placed in that like 8 p.m. window, which is great for those schools to play not at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock because it's hot as fuck. But the Big 12 is going to want a game at 1 o'clock. And then another game for its TV partner at 4 o'clock. And then another one at like 6:30. And another one at like 8:30 so it can be on all fucking day. That's the whole point of all of this and why the Big Ten wanted those USC and UCLA schools to begin with, because now they have the excuse to play at 6 o'clock at night and be in that TV window. Is its actual membership, like, is Ohio State going to be thrilled to play in California at 8 p.m. Pacific time, which is 10 or 11 o'clock their time? Probably not. But the network's going to get all those checks because now it can be in all those extra windows over and over again. And that's what's basically driven all of this. It's all about football. It doesn't have to do with men's basketball because no one really cares about men's basketball other than the NCAA tournament. Yep. And how the conferences end up and how they get picked and all that doesn't really matter. That's the money making is the NCAA tournament for all the conferences. But because like how many times are you really tuning in for as the average fan tuning in for the big like 5 p.m. game or whatever in conference? No one cares. No. Non-conference basketball is actually more important, and that's a whole another weird construction of who's playing who. When Gonzaga plays Duke, what television station gets it? That's its own thing. It doesn't have to do with conference scheduling. So it's a shame that the Pac-12 is the one that got killed. It's because of its crappy leadership for years and not being able to find a streaming partner, and part of it's just bad luck. They were the last one with the way the contracts work to get in on this. The Big 12 beat them to it. So the Big 12 got the money. The Pac-12 couldn't find the money. It was going to go to Apple, and that was never going to work. And I think it's pretty clear as soon as USC and UCLA left, they couldn't find a TV deal that was going to give them the money because now they weren't as enticing. And they couldn't find any partners to go grab or any schools to grab to replace those teams because there's no one on the West Coast. Unfortunately, there's a lot less West Coast colleges than there are however many else in Division I sports. I mean, we have 4 in Arizona, and I think Illinois has like 9 Division I colleges for basketball or football or whatever it is. And they just got left behind. And unfortunately, it's going to kill a brand that existed for a long time unless the Mountain West decides to, for some weird reason, call itself like the Pac West or whatever. And I don't really envision that happening, especially if Stanford and Cal, which we haven't even gotten to in this, somehow get invited to the Atlantic Coast Conference because Stanford playing Duke in basketball screams ACC. But again, guess what the ACC could do? It could have those 2 teams in that window against the Big 12 and the Big 10 because there's a giant gap in space, which is why I think it's been funny. Washington State's been bragging, saying, look at how high our TV numbers are versus other schools. Washington State, I have watched more of their football than almost any other school in the country in the last decade because they were always on at 8:30 at night at the end of the day because they always got tucked into that ESPN window. And everyone else realized that's a lucrative window on the West Coast. You can still get advertising money that late at night.
I don't know if it's a spam comment or not. It's like a pink hand waving. Well, we'll see. If they start spouting off things about Hitler, we're going to know pretty quickly. Yeah, I mean, I just think I would love to know behind the scenes, and I'm sure more is going to come out in the days and weeks to come, and at some point it'll probably be a 30 for 30.
It's a great 30 for 30.
Like, just the inner machinations of what the hell happened and what conversations were going on and who knew what when. Because for something of this magnitude to happen so quickly, these were in the works for a while, and we just didn't see it.
And it's mostly Washington and Oregon who knifed the Pac-12. I think they lied to everybody one night, said, hey, maybe we'll actually come together and sign a grant of rights, which locks everyone into these conference agreements. It was pretty clearly a move to make the Big Ten give them a little bit more money to leave and bail. They were not going to stick together. The Apple deal was so low and depended so much on clicks and streams. It was like a click for pay type of thing, and it wasn't going to work. So they tricked everyone into thinking, oh yeah, we'll come to the table and decide. They go and have this meeting, and then 2 hours later they're in the Big Ten. Like they were at 7 o'clock Pacific time. They were in a meeting discussing signing this grant of rights deal with the rest of the schools, and then 2 or 3 hours later, were literally announced on Twitter and on their school's websites as being in a new conference. If that doesn't tell you what was already a deal, I don't know what does.
And some reporters ended up looking very foolish as a result.
Yeah, they got
a lot
used.
of them were saying like, "Oh no, like I've heard that this is not happening," and that's clear that they were just a ploy.
Speaking of things that would drive gambling rates,
Yeah,
if you had,
I don't know how you'd bet on.
Yeah,
this
you
team
bet
will be in
will-
this conference,
yeah,
but
will the Pac-12 fall apart? Well, they would have fucking tricked everybody in that 2-hour time span because it looked real. And I read it and I'm like, that's a lie. I know exactly what they're doing because I know how this is going to work. And sure enough, and then to Dave's point, as an ASU alum, he texts me panicking basically of like, oh my God, what is the president of ASU doing? To his credit, he was desperately trying to keep a conference together that existed for 100 years and not be the guy who killed it. USC and UCLA had already effectively killed it because they were never going to get the money that all the schools were used to without those schools. San Diego State had a great run. San Diego State was not going to be the LA market everyone was saying. And they're a great school, have been really good at football and basketball and deserve to probably be in a better conference. But it was never going to move the needle because you need 80 years of tradition to actually generate any of this true reputation. And so it was dead. And the ASU held U of A back a little bit before being the schools that were going to actually kill the conference by moving over to the Big 12. But at that point, with the schools that were left, they needed to go. Yeah, I respect the schools trying to stick around, and it's a bummer for Stanford and Cal, who are very good in the non-revenue sports, to be locked out of this because they're not as good in those two. And it's a bummer for Oregon State and Washington State, who, again, if you had picked two schools in the 12-team conference that you'd kick out for media market, unfortunately, it's them, and it effectively happened. Rather than kicking them out, they just got left behind.
yeah, they got kicked out by proxy.
And I think we've talked about that for a long time. And again, if I'm a Big Ten school and I'm like Rutgers, and I have the quote unquote like New York TV market, I'm real worried that one day UConn's going to join the Big Ten, and I'm going to get my ass kicked out. Because if they can do these little partial revenue things where some schools make more money than others, which is what the Big Ten did to get Oregon and Washington on a discount, who's to say that that's not going to happen more as time goes on?
Yeah, because why would Alabama want to split as much with the SEC as some of the lesser schools in that conference?
Why does Alabama think it should get an even share with Vanderbilt? And that's how we're going to get to the Super League version of this, which now we've gotten to the point of, which, again, funny enough, there was a rumor today San Diego State was trying to recruit some of the better teams from the American and the remaining Pac-12 schools and the best schools of the Mountain West to make a better version, basically, of Conference USA, which is a genius idea. But they were shot down with that because the Mountain West has tricked everybody into signing a deal where they can't actually get out. But this isn't over. In 3 more years, we're going to have some more movement of all this. Every time a media deal's up, everyone's going to look for the next way to generate a little bit more money for their departments.
And then we won't have conferences and divisions at all, and then it'll just be like a labor-intensive version of professional sports, and that's going to be its whole other debate with NIL and other issues. So, stay tuned.
Fun.
More to come. I have a clip to play for our next item on the list, and that's Kevin Brown. No, not the former Rangers pitcher.
Dodgers pitcher.
Yeah, Rangers pitcher. But rather a broadcaster. And if you haven't heard about this, well, I actually think I've pulled the clip successfully. I'm going to play it and then make sure it's actually playing the audio. But to set it up a little bit beforehand, and we'll go into it more afterwards, essentially, he had been suspended for the last 2+ weeks for comments on air, and when I heard about that, at first I assumed it was probably another Tom Brenneman situation, with there's a deep drive to left and et cetera, right? One of my favorite memes. I love that meme. If that was on the meme list when we did that, it was going to be an automatic S tier. Interrupting something horrible that you're saying and then apologizing, and then there's a deep drive to left by Castellanos. So I, again, went into this thinking like, oh boy, what did somebody do now? Was it making fun of homosexuals on a hot mic? Was it Tom Brenneman? Was it this? Was it that? Instead, it was this. And I'm going to start playing it and double check the audio is playing, but then I'll let the audio rock.
For the Orioles, Brandon Hyde has felt like this has been maybe the toughest ballpark to play in, but the Orioles have a chance to do something special today. They've already clinched at least a split in the series, winning 2 of the first 3, and they could pick up a series win behind Tyler Wells today. It's been a minute. The Orioles split a 2-gamer with the Rays in June. They had lost their last 15 series here at Tropicana Field. You have to go back to when our now colleague Brad Brock picked up the win in the series finale June 25th, 2017, the last time the Orioles won a series here at St. Pete. Already got 3-2 at the Trop this year after winning 3 of 18 the previous 3 years combined. It is a stark difference, Ben, and it is not a bad Rays team. It's not like all of a sudden the Rays became slouches in the American League East. They've led this division every day, but now 2, and the Orioles once again are back alone in first place.
Yeah, I like the ending of that. I think that's my favorite part more than anything else. So, what does this all mean? What happened? Well, it sounds like he might be coming back Friday because of the backlash to this, which really only spread over the last 24 hours. The suspension dates back to, I believe, July 22nd or 23rd.
Sounds right, yeah.
And it was only recently that Awful Announcing, which holds stuff like this to task, put out there that sources had told them that that little on-air segment of about a minute was the reason for the suspension, because John Angelos, the owner of the Orioles, is notoriously petty. And it seems like for whatever reason, that clip, which sounds pretty innocuous, was enough to make it seem like he was calling out the team or saying something negative or making them look bad. It is rare on the internet, as Cody well knows, as a denizen of it himself, that you can find people come out against something unanimously. The revolt against this has been unanimous. It's unusual, but it makes a lot of sense in this particular case.
What's, I think, most amazing, this is not a slight against Kevin Brown in any way, he didn't come up with that stat to say on air.
Yeah.
As a person who has prepped broadcasters with information and notes, that probably came from sports information inside the Orioles. Do you think that Kevin Brown thought up the tropical depression joke there on the top of that graphic? No, he didn't make the graphic. This was an interesting stat, and it's trying to highlight that the Orioles are doing better, obviously. He's doing his job. And he took the fall, basically, for people telling him to write this. I wrote many of these stats all over the place because you're trying to highlight, oh, the team's doing really good this year. Look at the things they've done that they haven't been able to in the past. So the fact that this is, and I saw it on Twitter, was in the game notes and obviously was part of the broadcast rundown plan. It's not like he went rogue and even said anything controversial.
Nope, that was planned. It was planned. It was pre-planned because, as you noted, there was a graphic on the screen for the audio listeners that was going alongside that. And even if you couldn't see the graphic, you could hear the music, the little bumper that was playing alongside said graphic, which is not something you can make up on the fly. That was prepared for that segment. It was a block. They were going to talk about it specifically. And I thought, I'm hesitant to say Michael Kay made a great point, but he did in this particular case where he said, if you're going to make him the scapegoat, it should be everybody in, I don't know, the entire PR and or marketing department, the entire research department, the producer that let the segment go on air, because it was not off the cuff. It was planned, and there's no excuse for making one person the scapegoat for that just because they were on air.
It's about 8 people, probably at least, that go into these meetings. Again, for baseball, it's even trickier because it's every single day for series on end. But these production meetings, you go over meticulously what we're going to talk about this in pregame. Sports information people, PR people, what are the things that you want to break down? I offer, again, I did this but professionally. You offer up, okay, yeah, just so you know, like, the home teams won the last 8 games in this series. So if we're on the road, that means we might lose this game if you're the home broadcast. You're just being very frank and honest about it. That's all they did. And it's bizarre to, again, you assume he says something like, wow, this guy fucking sucks, basically, in a nice way, and he's criticizing the team's on-field play. That still wouldn't be okay.
No.
To criticize him. But at least there's, something to where he himself thought that comment, and the ownership didn't like it and doesn't like them criticizing their own players, which you shouldn't do. Your broadcasters can say and call the game as they see it and not be interfered with. It's not that complicated, as long as they don't say offensive Tom Brennan stuff.
It would have been bad enough if this was before this season. Yeah. And this graphic ran just to point out that the Orioles have been really bad in general, but particularly against the Rays over the last 3 seasons. If this doesn't include this season's result, and it's just, well, they're 0 for their last 18, well, that would have been bad, but it's still true. It's still facts. And while it might not look good, it also could still be presented in a way where it's like, well, maybe this is the time to break the schneid. In this one, he's even pointing out on 2 different occasions, they're 3 out of 5 against them this season, and they split this here, and a win tonight guarantees a win. And the Rays are pretty good, but the Orioles are definitely bucking the trend, they're moving in the right direction. And this team is 30 games above 500. That is nothing to be concerned about now. They're really good. It's a young and talented team. So for their owner to be pulling petty shit like this, it's like, why are you distracting and detracting from a season that's going really well over something so tremendously stupid?
Yeah, I mean, again, in his eyes, I'm assuming he isn't like, oh, someone's being critical of our team. We'll deal with it. You've been a pretty bad owner and had a bad team for multiple decades.
Yeah, you weren't trying to win for multiple of those seasons, so don't pretend like it's a pain in the ass now for people to say that.
Yeah, and now you're actually trying to highlight it, your own broadcast trying to point it out. I mean, he's literally wearing the fucking Orioles logo. the guy is behind the team. I actually have problems with it at times watching like Dodger games, for example. I actually think they're too positive about the Dodgers. I'm like, maybe you should point out when they're playing like shit more often. Teams don't own the team, or broadcasters don't do that enough because they're fearful for this exact type of outburst from an owner who are all so sensitive, despite the billions of dollars they have, about their stupid little project. It's just baseball, first off. And two, you're responsible for being terrible more often than not. It's ownership's fault. It's not the players, it's the team you piece together. If you're as bad as the Orioles have been, as you just said, it was a choice to be that bad. Those losses are on the Angelos family or whoever owns it and is the actual owner now. And so it's just bizarre. And again, now they're going to bring him back, and you made a bigger issue out of your team and looked worse than what he said. Even if he was being negative, and it was before the season, as you said, it wouldn't have been as impactful for anyone to be like, oh yeah, the Orioles totally sucked. How embarrassing. It's embarrassing now when you again had basically the entire internet and every member of the broadcasters, community pointing out how bullshit the Orioles were acting.
It would have been terrible if he had been reprimanded for this behind the scenes.
Oh yeah.
That already is gross negligence on the behalf of an owner to take someone to task for saying facts on the air. Again, no racial slurs, no epithets, just facts. That would have been bad, like a slap on the wrist privately to go, hey, I didn't really like that segment. You shouldn't do that. That would have been bad. This is spite. There's nothing else to say for it. It's spiteful. It's ridiculous. Everybody who's called it out has been absolutely right to do so. And even though I'm not in broadcast journalism, despite running some kind of makeshift TV studio and having a really poorly produced podcast version back when I was in college, I look at this and I go, even I know, just from what limited parts of this I see from journalism and my dabbling in TV, that this is absolute horseshit. And tonight, during the game, this was happening, I guess, maybe 45 minutes before we went live, there was a free Kevin Brown chant starting up at the Orioles game tonight. So if you really wanted to make this as big of a deal as possible and make yourself look bad, congratulations, you succeeded.
I guess you unified all your fans together. That's cool. You were already, in first place. And
who
doing
were
really
already
well.
having the time of their life because you have a good team for the first time in like a decade.
Which, again, amazingly, despite this being, I think, one of the probably worst owners in baseball and most despised, if you actually know more of the Nationals issue with TV broadcasting stuff out in that coast, most of the people around baseball without a rooting interest probably want the Orioles to succeed. From my perspective, that's the American League team I'll be cheering for in the playoffs. I want them to do well. As you said, they're a really young, fun team. So you already had a bunch of people behind you. You didn't need some like ultra villain like it's Major League to everyone work together to hate and spite the owner.
You're in a division with the Red Sox and the Yankees. You already have a leg up on getting the national interest outside of those two markets.
It's pretty easy.
But it wasn't. They've made it super difficult. So we'll see what comes of this story. Again, supposedly the rumors today are that he's going to be reinstated for Friday. It's going to be really fascinating to see what that first on-air segment looks like. Does he address it at all? Does he not? Because it'd be awkward either way. How much can he say? Because he couldn't say this. So what can you say about a suspension now? He hasn't said anything about it in the interim, which is obviously smart because that's a surefire way to lose your job, whether you're in the right or not. But boy, I've never been more interested in an Orioles pregame show than I'm going to be on Friday if this is the case.
Trust me, I think people will pick that up. It'll be on Twitter. Some people will clip it since everyone's been behind this anyway.
Going to be fascinating to see. Our last topic, and we'll spend a little less time on as we wrap things up, is Evo 2023. So I have to intro this because Cody doesn't have any fucking idea. Although I did ask him if he wanted to go to this because it was in Vegas, and he loves Vegas.
My second home.
That's right.
I'll be returning again in another month.
Of course you will. I'm amazed it's just another month and not sooner, to be honest. Evo 2023 had plenty of successes, the biggest player pool ever, particularly because of Street Fighter 6, which we'll talk about in a minute. But just in general, like a really well-done event. Production went well. They had a pretty major sponsor this year in Chipotle, and the fans of the community, because they know that they're smaller and tight-knit, unlike esports, did a good job of kind of gassing up Chipotle whenever they could. When they would cut to things during the broadcast, the crowd would go crazy, even though they know it's an ad. They're trying to show support. Huge crowd at the Michelob Ultra Arena, which I believe was sold out, or at least, I'm sure they had some stuff in production. It's like not every seat was full, but every seat that was available, I believe, was. You can see like the sea of cell phone lights that was in this particular moment in the losers finals of the Street Fighter 6 tournament. So, the fighting game community walks out of that with a pretty feel-good weekend. They also had a blind player win a game in the bracket for Street Fighter because of the audio accessibility issues, so that was a plus. In general, a positive. In particular, I wanted to talk about this because of Street Fighter 6. I mentioned it a little bit in a past episode just to kind of be like, hey, this is coming out and I'm excited because I didn't really like Street Fighter 5, but I loved 4, so it's been a decade since I've cared. we got a chance to see Street Fighter 6 played at the highest level for the biggest stakes. Well, the second biggest stakes, I guess. EVO's the biggest tournament of the year, but there's $1 million invitational next month, so you can quibble over that. And it held up under every level of scrutiny. The games were really well balanced, back and forth. Almost all of them went to the last game decider. It was fast. It was frenetic. It was balanced. A lot of character representation. So I don't even really have you here for any reason other than to say, like, it was really cool, and I wanted to talk about it a little bit.
I mean, again, I don't know enough about this, but like, this is where you should be doing these things, by the way. Like, because everyone talks about trying to put basketball tournaments, sports tournaments in markets everyone's going to want to go to. This is like the perfect use of the million different arenas that are around Las Vegas and the million hotels and the easy way to partner with them to generate all of this stuff. It's the same as like why conventions go to Las Vegas all the time. So it's cool to hear that they were in the Michelob, which is very nice arena. It's in one of the nicest hotels on the Strip at Mandalay Bay, and actually would have been probably pretty cool to go to. I mean, looking at that, I had no idea it was going to be in that arena until you just mentioned it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, they've had a glow up the last couple of years in particular. I think it was there last year. It was at a different venue the year before that. They've been growing and having the success of a franchise as big as Street Fighter. I mean, it was that was the only one of the 8 games that were there for the weekend. But like that, having a new game, the Street Fighter is the biggest game in town. No disrespect to any like Mortal Kombat fans out there, Tekken, whatever. But to be able to parlay a new release into this big of a tournament, they've never had 7,000 players in an open event before. The brackets ran pretty smoothly. Turnout was great. Attendance was up. And this was, the big final. Not every event had a great tournament. Some did fine. There weren't any bad ones. But for Street Fighter 6 in particular to do well, I think portends good things for the entire fighting game genre, whether you play competitively or not, because now Capcom's going to look at this and go, oh, this is working. Let's devote even more resources into it.
So you're saying it sold out for like the championship round inside that arena?
Yes. So they had championships all day Sunday. It was like a 10-hour affair, but the main event was Street Fighter 6 because that had 7,000 entrants on its own. That was like all 7 of the games combined or thereabouts, so it was a big deal.
To put it into scope, that's where the Las Vegas Aces play, the WNBA team. That arena is about 12 to 13,000. Mm-hmm. And obviously, you said there's going to be some production stuff. You're going to block off some seats and all that, but that's a large space to sell out for something like this. And again, your point, that should encourage people to try this out. Again, if the crowd being that supportive of a sponsor, it's only going to attract more sponsors. You look at that and you see that many, eyeballs and that many people were in that arena for that. That's the way to build this more or less, is to try and build it off of the new release of that game.
Chipotle, an absolutely massive get. You can quibble with that as well. You can say, well, why wasn't the prize pool bigger if they had a sponsor of that caliber attached to it? It was like $20,000 for first, which is huge for a fighting game tournament, and peanuts for an esports type tournament where, you have like League of Legends tournaments handing out $1 million prizes. But nonetheless, it's a stepping stone. The fighting game community is grassroots. It doesn't have the backing of big companies like this very frequently. So I'm just excited to see it. I've been playing a lot of Street Fighter 6. I'm up to gold on multiplayer. I'm not bragging when I say that. I'm on the lower side of the bell curve, but like I'm not in platinum or master. But because the controls are so accessible, there's the whole modern set where it's like you can get certain combos by pushing one button. You get less damage than if you do them manually, but I now know when I'm playing, like, I can rely on my fundamentals. I don't have a ton of time to play these games anymore. I can't sit there and learn some kind of 75-button combo that has a bunch of different inputs and timings. But now I know when I play this, if somebody whiffs a Dragon Punch on me, I'm taking 50% of their health because I'm going to hit these 4 buttons and I'm going to do this shit to them. So it's more about spacing, fundamentals, timing, reactions. I think people are going to find that between that and the fact that this had a good single-player mode, that all the goodwill Street Fighter lost at the release of 5 has come back in spades for the release of 6. And I think that's really good news for anybody who likes fighting games, even if it's not Street Fighter. And that's all I have to say about it. That's the end of the episode. You made it. Congratulations. There's the outro.
I can find more things to complain about. I'm sure I can.
We could. And I even thought, like, do I go all sports tonight? Do I put like the U.S. women's national team on here? And I'm like, what is there to say about it?
I having gotten up early in the morning to watch 3 of those
joked
games.
About it. We joked about doing that. And we're like, no, it's 2 a.m. or something.
I woke up and I watched all of them from my bed, and it was a bad idea.
Yeah, what a way to collapse at the end. That would have been such a cool double save if it had counted, but VAR had other ideas.
The good news for me, because it's all about me, is
you bet against them.
Somebody saw that Sweden was 18-1 to win the World Cup going against the United States and put $10 on them. So now I'm a big Sweden fan.
Yeah, and obviously the biggest reason for the whole backlash was because of primarily Megan Rapinoe, but not just her and people delighting in their failure and all that. To me, it was like this team just wasn't good enough. You can argue about some of the roster selection, and it's pretty stunning to be the number 1 rated country in the world and be out in the round of 16.
We could be worse. You could be Germany, who was number 2 in the world and didn't make the round of 16.
I suppose, yeah. And there's not as much political stuff going on with them. They just sucked.
Yeah, the weird criticism of talking shit about how, oh, look at the team's too woke and they lost and all that. Just to end this up, well, they were pretty woke when they won 2 World Cups. So
that's right.
I don't think not everyone just turned lesbian all of a sudden that was on that roster that you want to criticize. They were all there before, so their wokeness has nothing to do, obviously, with their loss, but the results kind of speak for themselves, honestly.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I don't blame Rapinoe because she wanted to play for her country. She's been a mainstay for them for so long. She was washed.
Yeah.
Forget the political side of things. She was not good in any of her appearances, and you can argue, I mean, they had a lot of reasons they lost that game. She might have been the main reason why.
To be fair, and again, this is copium and making excuses for it. They were missing one of their better players.
Sure. Yeah. But they should still be good enough to beat Sweden.
Yeah, exactly. They
Their
should be good
offense
enough.
was terrible all tournament.
But not having Mallory Pugh, now Swanson, since she married Dancy Swanson, not having her didn't really help a whole lot. Not having one of their backs, forced Julie Ertz to play back there. It's a bummer that there's a couple reasons why they really weren't all their, at their best. Also, their coach is terrible. Because he's now coached the Olympics and he coached the World Cup. And I believe I saw the stat that he's won 4 of 11 or 4 of 10 of the matches. He's drawn a bunch of them, but they've also now had basically the worst result in the Olympics and the worst result in the World Cup that they've ever had, I think. And that's probably going to get you fired. We apparently cannot hire coaches in the United States to coach our teams.
Probably not. Well, beatings will continue until morale improves, I guess. We'll see him in 4 years. That's the end of this episode. Thank you for joining Cody. Give him love in the comments if you comment or hate. I don't really care. Do whatever you like. In between episodes, you can find us on our website, objectionnetwork.com or youtube.com/objectionnetwork. That thing at the top is wrong. It's supposed to be August 15th. That's next week. But don't worry about that. We'll be back next Thursday as usual. I think Sean and Dave will be there, and then Sean's gone, and then I'm gone for a week. It's a whole thing. But next week, we'll all be there. We'll see you then.